Hello and welcome back to RPG PhD. I'm Dr. Ben. Many GMs think about failure as something that happens when a roll goes wrong. That's accurate as far as it goes, but it describes the surface. Underneath the failed roll is a sequence of psychological events with predictable patterns and predictable emotional outcomes. And the whole sequence responds to deliberate design choices the game master either made or defaulted into, perhaps without knowing it. 3 of those design choices are doing most of the work. One determines how much the failure hurts. The other determines who or what gets blamed for it. And one determines how long the player is still turning it over in their head a week later. A game master who understands all 3 can run failure at their table with the same intentionality they bring to encounter design or pacing. So let's get into it. You make a bet. I'll flip a coin. Heads, you win $20. Tails, you lose $20. It's a fair bet by any mathematical standard. Expected value is 0. Most people ask whether they'd take it, say no. Ask them how much the win would need to be before they'd take the bet at all, and the average answer comes back somewhere around $40 to $50. People need the potential gain to be roughly twice the potential loss before they'll accept an even money proposition. Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky documented this pattern systematically across the 1970s and published a widely cited paper, Prospect Theory. The finding that sits at the center of this is the one they called loss aversion. Losses and gains are not symmetrical. Losing $10 produces approximately twice the emotional response that gaining $10 produces. The pain is disproportionate to the math, and it's consistent across populations, cultures, and contexts. The asymmetry makes reasonable evolutionary sense. Weighing threats more heavily than opportunities kept ancestors alive long enough to pass on the tendency. But at the table, it produces effects that game masters and designers often misread. Death is more devastating than treasure is exciting. That's loss aversion in operation. A party that loses their mentor NPC might feel it harder than they'd feel the equivalent gain of a powerful new ally. A failed social role that costs the group their political standing might register more acutely than a successful one that builds equivalent standing. A stolen magic item and a found one of identical power are not the same emotional event. The theft hurts more. It shows up in player decision-making too. When a character has built something worth protecting, players start playing more cautiously than the odds actually warrant. They might burn resources on encounters that don't require them, or avoid risks that would objectively be worth taking. The math is the same, but the reference point has changed. The loss now feels larger than any equivalent gain could feel good. A player who was bold at session 2 is suddenly reluctant at session 12, and the game master might read it as the player losing interest, when what's actually happened is they've accumulated enough to be afraid of losing it. Game masters intuit some of this. Many experienced game masters know that threatening something is often more engaging than offering something. What loss aversion adds to that intuition is precision. The emotional asymmetry is predictable, roughly quantifiable, and the reference point determines where the baseline sits. The reference point is what the player currently has or expects to have. Everything gets evaluated relative to that baseline. A character who loses a sword they've carried for years is below their reference point. A character who never had a sword in the first place can't be below a reference point they never occupied. This is why the same mechanical loss hits completely different at session 1 versus session 30. The longer something has been part of the character's story, the higher the reference point climbs, and the deeper the loss registers. Systems handle loss aversion mostly by accident. Death mechanics are the cleanest example. Permanent death might generate more emotional engagement than resurrection systems because the reference point is higher, not because finality is inherently dramatic. When everything is on the table, the player's current condition is always at risk of a catastrophic drop from their baseline, and the brain treats that potential drop as roughly twice as motivating as the potential gain of equivalent magnitude. Resurrection mechanics don't eliminate loss aversion, they shift the reference point. The player is losing resources, time, and perhaps narrative momentum instead of the character itself. The loss is smaller but still real, and it still operates asymmetrically against equivalent gains. Equipment and inventory systems operate on a similar principle. A game that lets players accumulate gear, relationships, and property over time is building reference points with each session. The fighter's enchanted sword is a raised baseline. When a system has meaningful item loss, cursed equipment, or mechanics that can strip a character of what they've accumulated, the emotional weight of those moments scales with how long the player has held the thing being taken. Designers who build attrition mechanics into their systems often find that players respond with more distress than the mechanical stakes appear to warrant. The stakes the designer sees are on the character sheet in a way. The stakes the player feels are everything above their current reference point. For game masters, the practical takeaway is this. You don't need to threaten death to activate loss aversion at your table. Threatening what the player has already built does the same work with less risk of breaking investment. The reputation they spent 4 sessions constructing. The relationship that cost them something to earn. The plan they brought to the table 2 sessions ago and have been executing since. Each of these carries a reference point, and each of those can be lost. So the party spends 2 sessions negotiating a political alliance with the city council. Careful role play, well-chosen arguments, a couple of tense dice rolls. They build something that took real effort to build. Then, 1 session later, an NPC betrayal collapses it. The plot can recover. The party will have to find another path. But 2 sessions of accumulated investment just registered as a loss, and it's going to hit significantly harder than building that alliance felt good in the first place. The game master might have expected the betrayal to feel dramatic. What they may not have accounted for is the magnitude. Understanding loss aversion means knowing that the asymmetry was coming before you pull the trigger on a move like that, and designing the recovery path accordingly. Understanding the magnitude is a reason to make the move deliberately, not to avoid it. Something goes wrong. Somebody assigns blame. That's the question attribution theory was built to answer. When an outcome happens, how do people explain it? Fritz Heider laid the conceptual framework in his 1958 book, The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, and Heider and Kelley developed the formal framework through the late 60s and 70s. The core finding is that people attribute outcomes along 2 axes: internal causes, ability, effort, choices, versus external causes, luck, difficulty, and circumstances. Get a promotion at work and you're likely to attribute it internally. You worked hard, you were good at the job. Get passed over and the attribution tends to shift. The boss doesn't recognize talent. The process was political. The circumstances were stacked. The pattern runs in every direction. Successes attributed inward, failures attributed outward, consistently and predictably across populations. Human cognition assigns causality this way almost as a default. 2 additional patterns are worth naming here because they show up constantly at the table. The self-serving bias, documented across decades of social psychology research, describes the tendency to attribute successes to internal causes and failures to external ones. The fundamental attribution error, named by Lee Ross in 1977, describes the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their character while attributing your own to circumstance. Both run at many tables across many players. So at the table, a failed roll might be attributed 4 different ways, and each one produces a different emotional response. External attribution, luck. I rolled a 2, nothing I could have done. This one stings, but it leaves the self intact. The player files it under bad fortune and moves on. External attribution, difficulty. The game master set that DC too high. This one produces frustration aimed at the system or the game master. The self is also intact, but now there's a target. Internal attribution, ability. I built this character wrong. This one cuts deeper. It attaches to identity, to the choices made before the session started, to the player's competence as a builder and strategist. Internal attribution, effort. I made a bad call in the moment. This one sits somewhere in between. It hurts, but it also implies the player could have done otherwise, which means they retain some agency over future outcomes. Many players don't land cleanly in one category and stay there. They cycle. A string of external attributions builds into a generalized frustration with the system or the game master. A string of internal attributions, especially ability attributions, starts to erode confidence in the character itself. Players in that state might stop taking risks because the internal accounting has changed. They don't trust their own build anymore. The bold choices stop coming, and the game master might read the table as disengaged when what's actually happened is that a player has attributed themselves into passivity. Game masters are making attribution framing decisions every time they narrate a failure. The lock mechanism is more complex than you anticipated, is an external attribution. You rush the pick and the tension wrench slips is an internal one. Both describe the same mechanical outcome, but the emotional response differs, and so does the behavior. When another player fails, the table might attribute it to their choices, their build, their tactical decision. When a player fails themselves, they're more likely to attribute it to luck or circumstances. The asymmetry is a feature of human social cognition that shows up in groups where outcomes matter. Over time, it produces a systematic distortion in how the table reads its own dynamics. The player who gets labeled a liability is often just the person whose failures get consistently attributed internally by everyone except themselves. The player who gets labeled lucky is often the one whose successes get attributed externally by everyone except themselves. Neither label reflects what's actually happening. Both labels shape how the table behaves. A game master who understands attribution patterns can see past those labels. A game master who doesn't might keep addressing the wrong problem. Rolling a 2 on a crucial check feels bad. Rolling a 3 when you needed a 4 is the one that follows you home. Those two failures share an outcome. The check failed. The consequence follows. The scene moves on. What separates them is the counterfactual. In the second case, the player can see exactly what would have happened if the number had been one higher. The alternative was right there. That proximity is what generates regret. Graham Loomes and Robert Sugden introduced regret theory in a 1982 paper in the Economic Journal as a direct challenge to standard expected utility models. Their argument: people evaluate outcomes against the outcomes they would have received if they'd chosen differently. The counterfactual is a part of the emotional math, and its weight depends on how close it feels. Kahneman and Miller developed the related framework of counterfactual thinking, formalizing the observation that after negative outcomes, people generate if-only scenarios spontaneously and predictably. Near misses generate significantly more counterfactual activity than clean failures. The closer the alternative outcome felt, the harder the cognitive machinery works to construct the version of events where things went differently. This is where the three frameworks connect. Loss aversion tells you the failure hurts more than the equivalent success would have felt good. Attribution theory tells you where the hurt gets aimed, at the dice, at the game master, at the build, or at the choice made in the moment. Regret theory and counterfactual thinking tell you the specific shape of the wound. The wound is deepest when three conditions are met simultaneously. The thing lost carried a high reference point, loss aversion operating at full magnitude. The player's own choice put them in the near-miss position. That's internal attribution. And the counterfactual was close enough to feel reachable in hindsight. When those three land together, the failure becomes table lore. It's the one that gets brought up 2 years later. It's the one that shaped how a player approaches subsequent high-stakes moments in that campaign. Near misses are an underutilized emotional tool in encounter design, and the mechanism behind them is well documented enough that the gap is worth examining. A failure that lands exactly at the threshold, 1 point short, 1 round too late, 1 resource too few, generates far more emotional investment than a clean failure of larger magnitude. The player who fails by 20 points files the loss and moves on. The player who fails by 1 point is still in it, turning the moment over, finding the choice that would have changed it. The game master's real leverage over near misses isn't in the dice, it's in the structure of the encounter before the dice hit the table. A threshold the party can almost reach through good decision making is a near miss waiting to happen. That's the design question worth asking in prep. If the party plays well but makes one significant mistake, do they land at the threshold or clear it entirely? Encounters designed so that competent play with one error produces a near miss might generate more counterfactual investment than encounters where failure is simply binary. The deeper principle is that regret requires a real road not taken. When player choices don't actually branch the outcome, counterfactual thinking still happens, but it doesn't have anything to attach to. Now let's talk about some pitfalls of these theories. Using loss aversion as a punishment engine. A campaign built primarily on threats where sessions are defined by what the party risks losing rather than what they're building toward will eventually train players to stop attaching to anything. Attachment is where the pain lives, and if the pain is consistent enough, the rational response is to stop investing. Loss aversion generates engagement when losses are proportionate to investment, and when there's something being built that can also be protected. Threaten the thing the party has built, then let them build it back or build something new. The asymmetry only produces engagement when there's a positive reference point worth defending. Misreading attribution patterns as personality. The player who attributes every failure to the game master's difficulty checks and every success to their own choices is running the self-serving bias on default, the same way every person at the table runs it. The player who gets labeled a liability because the table consistently attributes their failures internally while attributing their successes externally is being read through the fundamental attribution error, and not through an accurate observation. Both patterns are evidence that your table contains humans, not evidence of character problems necessarily. A game master who takes attribution errors at face value will spend the campaign managing symptoms. The, quote, problem player who isn't actually the problem. The reliable player whose successes are more distributed than they appear. Understanding the underlying mechanism lets you see past the label to what's actually happening. Stacking all three at once. A high reference point, internal attribution, and a vivid near-miss landing on a single player in the same moment is a lot. It can produce the most memorable session the campaign has ever had. It can also break a player's investment in the story if the thing lost wasn't built with enough collaborative weight to survive it, or if the player's choices didn't have enough real agency to make the regret feel earned rather than imposed. The question before making a move of that magnitude is whether the table has enough shared investment in what's being lost and whether the player's choices actually put them at the threshold or whether the design put them there regardless of what they chose, ignoring the emotional residue after the session. These three mechanisms don't resolve when the dice go back in the bag. A player who left the last session deep in counterfactual mode might still be running those calculations when they sit down for the next one. A player who absorbed a loss at a high reference point and attributed it internally, they might be carrying that into every decision they make in the next session. Game masters who check in on the story but not on what the previous session left behind are missing the emotional continuity that determines whether a campaign holds its players across months of play or slowly loses them to the accumulation of unprocessed failures. So now let's look at a step-by-step guide. So for game masters, step 1, know what your players have built before you threaten it. Loss aversion operates on reference points. Before you put something at risk in a session, ask yourself how long the party has been invested in that thing and how much effort went into it. Threatening a relationship the party has cultivated across multiple sessions is categorically different from threatening one that appeared last week. The magnitude of the potential loss scales with the height of the reference point, and the height of the reference point scales with accumulated investment. Know which one you're working with before you pull the trigger. Step 2, narrate failure with the attribution axis in mind. Internal narration gives players ownership of failure, which might increase engagement and makes future choices feel consequential. External narration protects identity, which matters after a run of bad luck that's starting to compound. Vary the framing deliberately and pay attention to which players respond better to which mode. The player who goes quiet and self-critical after an internal narration might need more external framing for a few sessions. The player who starts externalizing loudly after every external narration might need a moment where their choice is clearly the variable. Step 3, design near misses through structure, not after the roll. Build encounters where the threshold is reachable through a different set of choices. Before the session, identify what decisions the players will face and where the real margins are. If a different choice at the market crossing would have changed the outcome, the near miss will emerge from the design when the dice land where they land. Step 4. Give choices that branch the possible outcome. Regret requires a real road not taken. If every path through the scenario converges on the same outcome, the counterfactuals the players generate after failure might feel false, and some players might even sense that. The design question to ask in prep is, if the party makes a completely different set of choices, do they get a different result? If the answer is no, the stakes aren't real yet. Step 5. Read the emotional weather during and after big failures. A player who goes quiet and starts listing what they would have done differently is in counterfactual mode. Give them a moment with it before moving the scene forward. A player who externalizes loudly is running attribution on the external axis, the dice, the DC, the circumstance. That's often temporary. A player who disengages from investment, stops generating, stops initiating, is downstream of loss aversion that might have been running too hard for too long without anything being built back. 3 frameworks, 1 moment at the table. So here's your homework. Think about the last failure that hit hard at your table. What was the reference point? How long had that thing been in the story before it was threatened? Where did the attribution land, and was that attribution accurate? Was there a near miss? And if there was, did it come from a choice the player actually made, or from the design landing close to the roll? The answers might tell you more about your table's emotional architecture. If this video gave you something useful, hit that like button, consider subscribing if you haven't, and drop a comment below with the failure your table still talks about. And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time.